Alright, hello once again, Jeff Scott from Jeff Teaches Programming. In the last video, we began a discussion of ASP.NET, and I'm going to continue that in this chapter. In particular, we started to go over Chapter 1 of the Murach's ASP.NET Core MVC text. Got through about the first 10 pages or so. So, we're going to continue on. As it says here, the model view controller MVC pattern is one that's typically used to structure web applications. It's not the only one available, but it is one that's used quite often, and it's one that we're going to use in what we're doing. Notice, as it says here, the MVC pattern divides an app into separate components where each component has its own specific area of concern. It's known as the separation of concerns. And we're going to look at each one of those. All right. They do mention in here the model is in charge of the data. Specifically, it gets the data and updates the data. It applies the business rules to that data and it validates the data. The view is basically your user interface. In the case of an ASP.NET application, it creates the HTML, the CSS, the JavaScript, etc. needed to respond to the browser when it makes an HTTP request. Finally, the controller is the intermediary. It is the glue between the model and the view. It receives the HTTP request from the browser. It determines the data to get, and it sends that data back from the model to the view. Notice the last paragraph in here. As it says, it's important to note that each component should stick to its own area of expertise and be as independent as possible. So the model, as it says, should retrieve and validate data, but it shouldn't format it, it shouldn't display it. The controller should move data between the model and the view, but it shouldn't apply any business rules to it. So here's kind of what it looks like. The HTTP request comes into the model. Comes into the controller. That goes to the model, which requests the data typically from a database server, gives it back to the model, gives it back to the controller, sends it out to the view, sends that back as an HTTP response to the user. Now, why do you want to use this? Well, the benefits are shown here. Makes it easier because you can have different people on the same team work on different components. You can automate testing, you can swap components in and out, and it makes the app easier to maintain. As it says, it does require more work to set up. All right, it's commonly used to structure web apps, and that's what we're going to do. We are going to convert our payroll C# object-oriented programming EF Core database payroll application into an MVC, or model view controller ASP.NET Core MVC application. The MVC, again, breaks the web apps into separate components. This is known as a separation of concerns. So let's get into it. They give you a little bit of a chronology here, and I'm not going to go over that. Feel free to read this, because like I said, you can go and you can get what I'm showing you right now, but I don't want to waste a lot of time going over history. You can see, though, that in 2007, Microsoft released ASP.NET MVC, meaning it's been around for around 20 years. All right? ASP.NET MVC, as it says, uses the MVC pattern. Okay, it says uses the same proprietary Windows-only ASP.NET frameworks as forms. So in other words, hopefully we're going to be able to make this application look similar in nature to what we created in a non-ASP app. Now, that was MVC. Core is about, 10 years old. Provides all the functionality of ASP.NET MVC, but with better performance. All right. I'm not going to go into the Core Razor pages. Okay, Now, next they talk about some of the components in here of the .NET framework and the .NET Core type of stuff. It says there's several differences between the .NET framework and .NET. All right, we're using the newer .NET Core platform. In this book, as it says, you'll learn how to use the MVC model to develop ASP.NET Core MVC apps. It says the model is older and more established, all right, than Razor Pages. We may brush on Razor in here as we go along. Don't worry whether we do or not. We're in this side right here, but we're going to concentrate on the MVC, the ASP.NET Core, all right, and the .NET Core. Now again, I don't want to sit there, I don't want to sit there and read this stuff to you. I'm trying to highlight what I think is the most important stuff in here. You may agree, you may not agree. All right. The next thing that they discuss in here is they talk about middleware. All right. And as it says, an ASP.NET Core app allows you to configure the middleware components that are in the request and the response pipeline, giving you flexibility over how an application works. Now we're going to look at the diagram on the next page, but notice what it says here in this paragraph that you see on the screen right now. It says the diagram in the figure gives you an idea of how middleware works. The authentication middleware authenticates the request, so it makes sure that the person is able to make that request. For instance, let's say I was back at my old job. Okay, I can go in and take a look at, or I could at the time go in and take a look at certain things about me that, for example, payroll had. I could get my payroll information, but I could not get, for example, my boss's payroll information. All right, middleware would authenticate that and only show me what I'm allowed to see. If the authorization middleware determines that the client is authorized, it passes the request to routing middleware, which uses a controller, all right, and basically goes through the procedure I showed you before. All right, it passes the information onto the model, which typically is going to get information from a database server, send it back to the model, send it back to the controller, which will take it and send it back where it'll be formatted and sent back in the view to the user. An ASP.NET Core app typically has a number of middleware components. So we'll talk about these as we go on. So here's kind of the way it looks right now. Now they mentioned down below here, and I'll leave this up here for a second, middleware can generate content for a response, edit the content of a request, edit the content of a response, or short circuit a request. In an ASP.NET Core app, you can configure the middleware components that are going to be used in here. All right. Let's talk for a little bit about state. State is the current status. All right. As it says, it's what the properties currently hold, the variables currently hold, the data currently holds. So for instance, my state right now is I'm sitting here making this video. It is 11:41 a.m. on the 28th of April. All right. As an app runs, it must maintain separate state for each user. So once we get this done and up and working, you could have two different people who are working on this or looking at this at the same time. Just as I showed you this, there could very well be two different people looking at the Rankin website, and hopefully for them, there aren't more than two people looking at it at the same time. Now, HTTP is a stateless protocol. So in other words, it doesn't keep track of state between round trips. So in other words, if a browser makes a request and gets a response, the state's lost. So if the browser makes another request, the web server has no way to associate what was asked previously with what was just asked. All right, ASP.NET web forms, which we're not using as it says, attempted to hide this by automatically maintaining state, whereas ASP.NET Core MVC does not attempt to hide the stateless nature of a web app. Rather, it provides features that give you control over each request and response, which can really help performance. Now, this is what I just mentioned. This is why state is difficult to track, because when the page is returned to the user, all right, the state is lost. So if you make another request, it starts the whole process all over again. That's why HTTP by default is what's referred to as a stateless protocol. All right. Now, some of the next stuff that's in here, they talk about using Visual Studio. Well, I've been using this all along, so I'm not going to go through this. I think that's kind of a waste of your time. All right. So we've seen this kind of thing that they show in here. Okay. Now, I just do want to mention, if you look up here, if you download all of the code that goes with this text, they build this guitar shop. It's kind of a neat application. All right, for a mythical guitar shop. I'm not going to go over Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code, for lack of better words, and my guess is that if other people heard me saying this, they wouldn't totally probably agree with what I'm about to say, and that is that Visual Studio Code is kind of a stripped down version of Visual Studio, and you can use it for a lot of different things. You can use it. You can actually use it to develop any kind of, I think at least, of C# apps, ASP.NET apps, and a lot of other types of things as well. All right, and it's free if you want to download it. So as you can see in this case, it wouldn't look that different. All right, now let's talk about, as it says here, how an ASP.NET Core MVC app actually works. All right. Now, as it says here, ASP.NET Core MVC uses something called convention over configuration. All right. What we mean is, there is a setup for the way things are supposed to look in here. There is a setup for the way that you create your folder or directory structure, and it's expected that you will do it that way. All right. At the top level, you'll have a root folder or a root directory. Okay. Within here, as it says, you typically define the C# files used to store classes that define controllers and models. The controller classes are put into a folder called controllers, or if you've got subfolders underneath there, okay? The model classes are in a folder named models. Well, we already have a folder named models. All right, so we'll be able to use virtually all of that. We may have to change some of it. We'll see as we go on. The view files are what are going to be used we will get rid of the two forms we have and then create a views folder and have a bunch of different views inside of there. The static files, we talked about static files before, things like images, CSS files, JavaScript files, are and should be stored into a folder named www.root. All right, we'll talk about that at a later time. So this is a typical kind of setup that you see right here. So this would be your top folder. That's your root right here, Guitar Shop. Then under Guitar Shop, you'd have a controllers folder with your controllers in it, a models folder with your models in it, a views folder, which could have subfolders, and www.root folder for your static files. We'll still have a program.cs file, as we talked about earlier. All right. By doing it this way, as I already mentioned, ASP.NET Core MVC uses this convention over configuration. Okay, where the top is the root, and then you've got a folder called controllers for your controllers, a folder called models for your models, a folder called views for your views. And if you have any static code, it goes into www root. All right. So, you might look at it and go, fine, big deal, who cares? Well, I mean, this is what we're going to be talking about for the next several chapters, or several videos, I should say. The rest of the videos in this series. But as I mentioned here, a model is a C# class that defines the data objects. What we've been doing. All right. As it says, all right, in this example, looks pretty similar to the kind of thing we've done. So if we had a product, we might have a primary key. You could call it just ID or product ID, as they've done here. A name of a product, and as it's a string, we're initializing it to string.empty, and a decimal value for the price. All right. And this is where this is explained on the previous page, but it looks a lot different because what we're doing is the same kind of an operation, but we're doing it through the use of ASP.NET. So let's go back to here. All right. So as it says, the model is the class that defines the data objects. All right. The class is stored in the model's namespace. The controller is a class that inherits from the Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.MVC.Controller class. All right. Notice it says an action is a method of a controller that returns an action result. All right. It's more dynamic. To do that, a method can use its built-in view method to return the type of an action, a view result. You ask for something, you get a result back. In the example here, the detail method is an action. The list method, as it says, gives you a list of products from the database. Okay. Now that's not everything. What we want is to be able to see something that looks more like this. So in other words, what you see on here is this would be the equivalent of an HTML page that would be returned. All right, and it would show you, notice we've asked for 1 here, so it shows us the ID of product 1, a Fender Stratocaster, which has a price of $699. If you click home, you'd go back probably either to just products here, not detail in 1. So as it says, most of a typical view file consists of HTML. Now, if you don't know HTML, if you don't, I would suggest going out to w3schools.com and under their tutorials, let's see. Oh, somewhere under here. I don't know if there's a thing called tutorials or not. All right, there's HTML right there. So if you want to learn more, go out to w3schools.com/HTML and it'll bring you to the default page. There is an HTML tutorial right there. Now, as they mention here, a view file can also contain Razor code. And Razor code is going to be basically C# code. The syntax will look a little bit differently. But what you're doing is you're interspersing C# code inside of, quite often, inside of your HTML. All right. Now, this is pretty heavy in here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over it. Okay. It says here, the @model directive specifies the class for the model, and the @model property allows you to access a model object that's created from a class. Okay, fine. So in other words, we're going to be doing stuff like this. This is a dot. Notice it's different. It's not a .cs file anymore. It's a .cs HTML file, which means it's a combination of C# and HTML. All right. This right here that you see in the yellow, where it says product detail, that's what made this. The words product detail right there. All right. Then we've got a table set up that shows the ID, the name, and the price. The ID, the name, and the price. All right. So as they mention here, most of a typical view file consists of standard HTML type of stuff. All right. And there's other things that we can go and add in there as well. I'm not going to read the rest of it. Okay. Finally, it says how the program.cs file configures the stuff for the app. Well, the program.cs file that we used and we have been using, or something similar to it in our programs, is going to change. It's going to look more like this. All right. I don't expect you to be able to look at this and understand any of it. It's stuff that we will have to go over. So let's take a quick look right here, because they explain. In fact, what I'll do is I'll keep this up and I'll go from what I got in my book here. All right, it says the program.cs file begins by creating a web application builder object. Then it contains the code that adds services to the app, and it builds the app. Next, it contains the code that configures the services that are added. Things like making sure that you've got a secure HTTPS connection, where the static files are that you're going to use, etc. So they mention here in the bottom of the page I'm currently on is the program.cs file contains the code that configures the middleware used by the application. They say, in other words, it builds the middleware pipeline. It contains the code that identifies the services to use and any additional configuration info that's necessary. So this is how you can request things. If you want to go to a home page, you can either do this or you can do this. If you want to go to the About under Home, you do this. If you wanted to go to the product listing page, you do this. If you want to go to the product detail page, you would use that. Now, I went through that quickly in basically a lecture and a half. So we're what? We're again about 20, going on to 25 minutes. So hopefully that made a little bit of sense to you. In the next chapter, what we will do is we'll go over, or in the next lecture, we're going to go over chapter 2. In chapter 2, as you can see, we will develop a single page MVC web app. All right, and I plan on starting that one shortly. I'll see you then.